There's a moment in every relationship when you stand at a crossroads. You feel it in your chest, a tightness, a knowing that something has shifted. The person you once laughed with now feels like a stranger walking through your life. You tell yourself it's just a phase, but that knot in your stomach knows better. This moment arrives quietly. It whispers through the spaces between words, through glances that linger too long, through silence that fills rooms where laughter once lived. You're witnessing love transform into something else, something that feeds on fear instead of growth. Here's what I've discovered after decades of studying human connection. Toxic relationships don't begin toxic. They begin when two people stop seeing each other clearly and start using each other as mirrors to feel worthy. The very thing we think will save us becomes the thing that slowly poisons what we're trying to protect. When I speak about relationships, I speak from witnessing thousands of people struggle with one fundamental question. How do we love without losing ourselves? The answer isn't found in relationship books or weekend workshops. It's found in understanding that we create what we are, not what we want. Modern relationships face a peculiar challenge. We're taught to complete each other instead of complement each other. We're taught to avoid discomfort instead of grow through it. These teachings create perfect conditions for toxicity to take root. But here's what most people miss entirely. Toxicity isn't about bad people doing bad things. It's about unconscious patterns playing out between two people who've forgotten they were whole before they met. Let me paint you a picture that might feel familiar. Sarah meets David at a coffee shop. They talk for hours. She feels seen in a way she's never experienced. He feels needed in a way that fills an empty space inside him. They fall in love with how they feel about themselves when they're together. But here's the trap nobody sees coming. Sarah begins depending on David's attention to feel worthy. David begins depending on Sarah's need for him to feel valuable. Neither realizes they've just created a house of cards where their sense of self depends entirely on the other person's behavior. Think about this. When you need someone else to behave a certain way for you to feel okay, you've just made them responsible for your emotional state. This is the seed from which all relationship toxicity grows. The first sign appears months later. Sarah feels that familiar knot when David spends time with friends. She doesn't say anything directly. Instead, she becomes distant when he returns. David notices the shift, feels that walking on eggshells sensation, and starts spending less time with friends to avoid the tension. Without realizing it, David has just taught Sarah that emotional manipulation works. Sarah has just learned that her discomfort can control another person's behavior. Neither intended this. Both are now trapped in a dynamic that will slowly erode their individual strength and their connection to each other. This is how it begins. Not with cruelty or intention to harm, but with two people who never learn to maintain their sense of self within a relationship. They start using each other as emotional regulators instead of learning to regulate themselves. Watch how this unfolds. When Sarah feels insecure, she seeks reassurance from David. When David feels inadequate, he seeks validation from Sarah. They've created a closed system where each person's emotional weather depends on the other's response. The relationship starts feeling like work because every interaction carries weight. Now here's what's really happening beneath the surface. Both Sarah and David carry unhealed wounds from their past. Wounds that whisper, "You're not enough as you are." These wounds create a hunger for external validation. When they first met, they felt temporarily filled by each other's attention. But wounds can't be healed by another person's love. They can only be temporarily soothed. As the initial excitement fades, those wounds resurface. Now they expect their partner to continue providing the soothing they once felt naturally. When this doesn't happen consistently, they begin to demand it. This is the moment when love transforms into something that looks like love but operates like addiction. The signs are always there. We just don't want to see them, or we see them and tell ourselves stories that make them seem acceptable. This might be the most dangerous aspect of relationship toxicity. It seeps in slowly, like water through a crack in the foundation. The first red flag is the gradual loss of who you are. When Sarah stops seeing her friends because David seems uncomfortable, she tells herself she's prioritizing the relationship. When David stops pursuing his photography because Sarah needs more attention, he tells himself he's being loving. But what's really happening is the slow erosion of the self. Here's a truth that might sting. Healthy relationships expand your world. Toxic relationships shrink it. If you find yourself giving up pieces of who you are to maintain peace, you're watching toxicity take root. The cruel irony, the very thing you're sacrificing to save the relationship is exactly what made you attractive to your partner in the first place. Another red flag is that walking on eggshells feeling. You start monitoring your partner's moods like a weather forecaster. You learn which topics to avoid, which friends not to mention, which dreams to keep locked away. You tell yourself you're being considerate, but you're actually enabling a dynamic where one person's emotional state controls the entire relationship. When you find yourself rehearsing conversations before having them, you're living in fear of your partner's reaction. When you start editing your authentic thoughts and feelings to avoid conflict, you've crossed into dangerous territory. Love doesn't require you to become smaller. Love doesn't ask you to edit your truth to make someone else comfortable. Watch for the blame patterns that emerge like clockwork. In toxic relationships, everything becomes someone's fault. If Sarah feels insecure, it's because David didn't text back quickly enough. If David feels criticized, it's because Sarah's tone was wrong. They stop taking responsibility for their own emotional states and start making each other responsible for their feelings. This creates what I call the victim-perpetrator dance. Each person believes they're the victim of the other's behavior. Each person believes they're justified in their defensive reactions. Neither sees how their own unconscious patterns contribute to the very dysfunction they're complaining about. Perhaps the most subtle red flag is the loss of curiosity about each other. Healthy relationships maintain a sense of wonder about the other person. You remain interested in their growth, their thoughts, their inner world. In toxic relationships, this curiosity gets replaced by certainty. You stop asking questions and start making assumptions. You stop being interested in who your partner is becoming and start trying to control who they are. Let that sink in for a moment. When we ignore these red flags, we pay a price that extends far beyond the relationship itself. The cost is nothing less than our connection to our authentic self. Each time we compromise our truth to maintain false peace, we move further away from who we really are. The first casualty is our intuition. Your inner wisdom starts sending signals that something is wrong. But because you want the relationship to work, you override these signals. You tell yourself you're being too sensitive, too demanding, too critical. Over time, you lose the ability to trust your own perceptions. When you can't trust your own inner guidance, you become dependent on others to tell you what's real. You start looking to your partner, your friends, your family, to validate your experience. You lose your center. You lose your ability to navigate life from your own inner knowing. This erosion of self-trust creates a ripple effect everywhere. You start doubting your judgment at work. You question your decisions as a parent. You second-guess your choices about friendships and life direction. The relationship becomes a laboratory where you learn to distrust yourself, and this learning gets applied to everything. Your emotional range begins to narrow like a radio losing signal. In healthy relationships, you feel the full spectrum of human emotion. Joy, sadness, anger, peace, excitement, disappointment, all are welcome. In toxic relationships, certain emotions become dangerous. You learn to suppress anger because it causes conflict. You learn to hide sadness because it makes your partner uncomfortable. You learn to dim your joy because it threatens their insecurity. This emotional suppression doesn't make the feelings disappear. It drives them underground, where they show up as anxiety, depression, physical illness, and addictive behaviors. You develop symptoms that seem unrelated to your relationship, but they're actually your psyche's way of expressing what you won't allow yourself to feel directly. The impact spreads like a virus to every other relationship in your life. When you're in a toxic primary relationship, you carry that energy everywhere. You become hypervigilant with friends. You become controlling with your children. You become suspicious of colleagues. Your dreams begin to shrink. The goals that once excited you start feeling impossible or impractical, not because they actually are, but because you've learned to make yourself smaller to accommodate your partner's limitations. You start believing your dreams are selfish or threatening to the relationship. Perhaps most tragically, you lose your capacity for genuine intimacy. True intimacy requires vulnerability, and vulnerability requires trust in yourself and your partner. When you're constantly managing emotions and monitoring reactions, genuine vulnerability becomes impossible. Now here's what's fascinating about this entire dynamic. The journey out of toxic patterns begins with a radical shift in focus. Instead of trying to fix your partner or change the relationship, you must turn your attention inward. This isn't selfish. It's the only thing that actually works. The first step is recognizing that you can only control one person in any relationship: yourself. This sounds obvious, but most people in toxic relationships spend enormous energy trying to control their partner's behavior, emotions, and responses. This is a losing game that creates more toxicity, not less. When you truly accept that you can't control another person, something profound happens. You stop wasting energy on impossible tasks and start investing that energy in possible ones. You stop trying to make your partner understand you and start understanding yourself. Self-awareness begins with honest observation. You must become curious about your own reactions without immediately judging them. When your partner triggers you, instead of focusing on their behavior, ask yourself, this is revolutionary thinking. We're trained to believe that other people cause our emotions, but the truth is more complex and more empowering. Your emotional reactions are information about your internal state, not evidence of your partner's wrongdoing. When you feel jealous, that jealousy is telling you something about your relationship with yourself. When you feel criticized, that feeling is revealing your own inner critic. This doesn't mean your partner's behavior doesn't matter. It means your reaction to their behavior is entirely within your control. Let me give you a concrete example. David comes home late without calling. Sarah feels angry and hurt. The old pattern would be for Sarah to blame David for being inconsiderate. and for David to become defensive. Both focus on the external event. The new pattern begins with Sarah getting curious about her reaction. Why does David's lateness trigger such intense emotion? What story is she telling herself? What fear is driving her anger? As Sarah explores this, she might discover that David's lateness triggers her childhood fear of abandonment. She might realize she's interpreting his behavior as evidence that she's not important to him. She might recognize that her anger is actually protection against the vulnerability of admitting she needs reassurance. This awareness doesn't eliminate Sarah's feelings, but it changes their meaning. Instead of evidence that David is wrong, her feelings become information about her own inner landscape. Instead of demanding that David change his behavior to manage her emotions, she can address the underlying fear that makes his behavior so triggering. When Sarah approaches David from this place of self-awareness, the entire dynamic shifts. Instead of accusations, she can offer vulnerability. Instead of demands, she can make requests. Instead of trying to control his behavior, she can share her inner experience and ask for what she needs. This kind of self-awareness requires practice and patience. You must learn to pause between trigger and reaction. You must develop the capacity to observe your own mental and emotional processes without being hijacked by them. Here's the beautiful paradox. When you stop trying to control your partner and start managing your own reactions, your partner often begins to respond differently. Not because you're manipulating them, but because you're no longer feeding the toxic patterns with your own unconscious reactions. Healthy relationships require boundaries, but most people misunderstand what boundaries actually are. They think boundaries are about controlling other people's behavior. They're not. Boundaries are about knowing where you end and another person begins. Boundary is not telling your partner they can't do something. A boundary is knowing what you will and won't accept and being willing to act on that knowledge. It's the difference between saying, "You can't talk to me that way," and saying, "I'm not available for conversations that involve yelling. I'm going to leave the room until we can speak respectfully." The first approach tries to control the other person. The second approach controls only yourself, while clearly communicating your limits. Setting boundaries requires reconnecting with your authentic desires and feelings. What kind of treatment feels good to you? What behaviors drain your energy? You can't set appropriate boundaries if you don't know where your actual limits are. Communication in healthy relationships is about authentic sharing rather than strategic maneuvering. You speak your truth not to control your partner's response, but to honor your own inner experience. You listen not to gather ammunition, but to genuinely understand your partner's perspective. Well, this requires developing what I call emotional non-attachment. You can care deeply about your partner while remaining unattached to their specific responses to your sharing. You speak because you have something true to say, not because you need them to respond in a particular way. The key is learning to communicate from love rather than fear. Fear-based communication tries to protect you from rejection. Love-based communication shares authentically, regardless of how it might be received. Fear-based communication manipulates. Love-based communication reveals. Now here's the secret that might surprise you. The healthiest relationships are between two people who don't need each other. They choose each other. They enjoy each other. They complement each other. But they don't depend on each other for their sense of self-worth or emotional stability. This doesn't mean being cold or disconnected. It means bringing your full, whole self to the relationship, rather than bringing your wounds and expecting your partner to heal them. It means being generous with love, because you have plenty, not because you need love in return. Individual wholeness begins with developing a relationship with yourself that's as important as your relationship with your partner. You must know who you are when you're alone. You must enjoy your own company. You must have interests, goals, and sources of fulfillment that don't depend on your partner's participation or approval. When you're secure in your own worth, you don't need your partner's validation to feel valuable. When you're comfortable with your own emotions, you don't need your partner to regulate your feelings. When you have your own life purpose, you don't make your partner responsible for your happiness. Here's the irony. When you become whole individually, you become more attractive as a partner. Wholeness is magnetic. People are drawn to those who are complete within themselves, because such people offer connection without neediness, love without manipulation, support without codependency. Part of this work involves developing your own sources of meaning and purpose. Your partner should enhance your life, not be the sole source of meaning in your life. You need interests that excite you, goals that motivate you, relationships that nourish you, and activities that fulfill you independent of your romantic partnership. When both people in a relationship are committed to their own wholeness, something beautiful happens. Instead of trying to complete each other, you inspire each other. Instead of filling each other's emptiness, you celebrate each other's fullness. This kind of relationship becomes a sanctuary for authenticity, rather than a strategy for getting needs met. The relationships we create reflect the relationship we have with ourselves. If we're at war within ourselves, we'll create relationships filled with conflict. If we're disconnected from our own truth, we'll attract partners who can't see us clearly. If we don't believe we're worthy of love, we'll settle for relationships that confirm this belief. But when we do the inner work of becoming whole, we naturally create healthier external relationships. We stop attracting people who need us to be different than we are. We stop accepting treatment that diminishes our spirit. We start choosing partners who celebrate our authenticity rather than trying to change it. Saving your relationships from becoming toxic isn't about learning better communication techniques, though these can help. It's about becoming the kind of person who naturally creates healthy dynamics. It's about healing the wounds that make you hungry for external validation and developing the inner strength to love without losing yourself. The most profound gift you can give to any relationship is your own wholeness. When you're complete within yourself, you offer love as a gift rather than seeking love as a need. You share your life rather than depending on someone else to give your life meaning. You connect from fullness rather than emptiness. This is how love was meant to be, not as a desperate grasping for what we lack, but as a generous sharing of what we are, not as a strategy for avoiding loneliness, but as a celebration of connection between two complete souls. When we love from this place, toxicity becomes impossible, because we have nothing to defend and nothing to demand. The choice is always yours. You can continue patterns that diminish both you and your partner, or you can begin the courageous work of becoming whole. The world needs more people who know how to love without losing themselves, who know how to connect without becoming dependent, who know how to care without controlling. Your relationships are waiting for the gift of your authentic, whole, healed self. The question that will determine everything is simply this: are you ready to give it?